So we're delighted to have Datacom with us as a sponsor at this event. Datacom are such a well-known name in New Zealand, but I was very keen to have Datacom talking about some of the clever stuff they do that we don't even realize that they're doing that's clever. So enough from me. Hand over to Datacom, over to David.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about cybersecurity. I'm not going to talk about a lot of tech, which is either going to fill you with a lot of joy or it might make you leave the room. What I'm interested to talk about is cybersecurity in a broader lens. And I also want to talk about some observations that we have as Datacom. We are New Zealand's largest cybersecurity services provider. The observations that we have about the industry, the sector, the New Zealand Defence Force sector, and just riff a little bit around those themes. We all know that cybersecurity is a challenging game. Staying on top feels a little bit like you're bathing water from a leaking boat. You can bail water 24/7, and no matter how good you are at not sinking, you've still got a leak in your boat. And that's pretty much how we feel in the cybersecurity sector. There's a lot of work to do, and there's the challenge is always with us. So I want to start this afternoon by actually looking backwards. So when we look at 2020, unfortunately, we've still, while we can look at most of the year in the rearview mirror, we've still got a little way to go, which most of us probably feel a little bit sanguine about. Most of us would like to be able to roll into 2021 pretty quickly. But if we look at 2020, it's been a busy year from a cybersecurity perspective. COVID obviously has meant that a vast number of our employees were accessing corporate systems from at home, which created lots of challenges for us in terms of understanding what the security postures were like in those environments, what our perimeter was like. If we hadn't done multi-factor authentication, we figured out how to do it pretty quickly. We probably found that we could do a lot more than we thought, a lot more quickly than we thought when there was a global imperative, which I think is a lesson for us around some of our corporate governance and the way that we run technology projects. So we've had COVID. We're still working through what COVID means for us in terms of how employees engage. How do we get the best of people when we don't see them as much as we used to? But DDoS also was a wake-up call for us in New Zealand. We realised that a fairly random, well, a targeted, but an old tech, quote unquote, attack made us look very, very quickly at our resiliency and looking at and we realised that we're not as resilient as organisations as we thought. That some of the way that we had viewed what our business continuity plans were needed to be pretty quickly looked at. But also that I think we found more nationally that we were far more engaged. We had much more interdependence within other organisations, within our supply chains and within our sectors than we thought. And so suddenly we're looking at the world in a more connected way. And I think that's also caused us to take pause and think, okay, we need to start thinking about what does a sector response look like in some of these things. The other thing, we've got a fairly major national milestone coming up in December, which I hope you know about. If you don't, you will find out about it pretty quickly, and that is the privacy legislation will change. So that it becomes now, for every organisation in New Zealand, we have obligations, legislative obligations with regard to privacy and keeping data on individuals secure. Wherever that data is, whether it's in a backup or whether it's in a data centre or whether it's in the cloud, we need to be starting to pay more attention to that. The reality for this is that while the penalties that are there post the select committee stage were a lot less onerous, than were initially envisaged, the reality is we've all got to learn about how to take care of data in a way that we probably haven't before. And the reality is, at least for the next little while, we'll probably be doing our learning in public. So that's December, something to look forward to. We are seeing signs in the market of more maturity in cybersecurity. What I mean by that is that we've seen cybersecurity traditionally with an IT lens, with a technology lens. It's about tech, and so a chief information security officer will sit inside the technology stack within an organisation. We're increasingly seeing organisations recognising that cybersecurity is broader than that. Cybersecurity fundamentally is about risk and understanding risk across a much broader tableau than simply the technology one. So we're starting to see organisations pivot and have a information security function reporting into corporate risk. I think that's a very healthy and very necessary sign of maturity. As I said to you before, with the DDoS, there is increasing awareness that we are part of an ecosystem, that each of us plays a role in an ecosystem, either as a supplier or part of a supply chain to another company, or with our own supply chains. And the interconnectedness of those of companies within the supply chain means that our understanding of cybersecurity risk needs to broaden from simply our parameters and the domains that we are comfortable with, but also that now needs to factor in other companies and their preparedness and their maturity around cybersecurity. Finally, I think 2020, we're still not as well prepared as we'd like to be in terms of cybersecurity, and we have little actual preparedness for an incident. While we may understand a cybersecurity incident in concept, we often see a cybersecurity incident as an IT incident that needs to be fixed. There's little understanding of the need for communications or the complexity of communication strategies that would need to cover customers, suppliers, regulators, supply chain, and your staff. Each requires a different strategy. So we're still not as prepared as we'd like to be, organisations across New Zealand, and there's still less understanding at senior executive and board level about the impact of an incident. And I think the last thing for 2020 is we've seen within New Zealand, the New Zealand context, a significant proportion of phishing for the last couple of years. If you look at CertNZ figures, that's pivoted away to ransomware, and ransomware has become more of the go-to for criminal gangs. It's simply easier to do. It's far more random, and it takes less effort, and the rewards are there. It's a very asymmetric game. As you know, ransomware is there's 100,000 addresses on that email, and only one of them needs to trigger. So it's a very strongly asymmetric game, and it's very difficult to fight given that it's asymmetric. Okay, so moving on. What does effective cybersecurity look like? How do we know that we have an effective cybersecurity posture? Well, I wanted to start by talking about what I would consider to be 4 fundamental axioms that are true of cybersecurity. The first is that there is no competitive differentiation around cybersecurity. And companies that think that there is approach cybersecurity from the wrong lens. Cybersecurity is an essential component of a corporate risk, but it is not a competitive differentiator in itself. We don't see airlines advertising on the basis that they don't crash. So in the same way, a cybersecurity incident is almost inevitable given the current state of the play. So you do not compete on the basis of that. The second is that within your sector, at least, a risk to one in your sector is a risk to all. So you are, whether you like it or not, you are sharing risk across your sector. If your competitor gets taken down in a cybersecurity incident, then trust and the brand value of you as part of that sector also gets impacted. Thirdly, talent is scarce. While we are doing a very, very good job in New Zealand of producing tertiary graduates, we've got something like 500,000 more graduates in the workforce than we had 20 years ago. we have been very, very poor at producing talent that has the skill sets that are required for particular technology disciplines, and cybersecurity is certainly one of those. I'll talk about a little bit about that later. And finally, within cybersecurity, we have far too much technology. You can walk around a trade show and a major trade show offshore, and there'll be 2,000 vendors in the trade hall. It's overwhelming customers with the complexity and the understanding the particular value propositions of particular niche technology. So the technology is actually an inhibitor to many organisations in improving their cybersecurity risk posture. The other thing is that to be effective at cybersecurity, you have got to understand risk, not technology so much. So if you can understand risk and use that to drive policy, then you can be far more cost efficient in how you implement technology. So if you spend $1 on risk and understanding risk, you're going to save $10 in terms of what you would actually end up having to put into terms of control points into your organisation, and also into the monitoring that you need to ensure that those control points are effective. So it's a risk that should drive your policy, and you can deal with a number of your risks simply through a policy lens without needing to have a technology solution. For example, you know, if your CFO wants to approve invoices while she travels on her smartphone, then you have very little option other than to monitor, put some control points on that smartphone and monitor it 24/7 to make sure that phishing and the potential of phishing is effectively dealt with from a risk perspective. Or you could have a policy frame that says, you know what, we're not allowing anyone with a smartphone while they're traveling to approve invoices. You've spent no money, but you've produced the same outcome. So risk is a very good place to start for effective cybersecurity. Organisations also need to understand that their risk is shared across their sector. We've talked about that a little bit before. A European study released last month said that 80% of businesses had seen a cybersecurity breach within their supply chain. So that's real, and it's a meaningful conversation to have within your sector. Effective cybersecurity also, we've spent far too much time thinking about the bad guy. We've objectified, you know, the bad guy as a gang or a person wearing a hoodie on the other side of the world. The reality is it's fundamentally disingenuous to do that. There's no single entity in a warfare sense that is the bad guy. We're fighting shadows. We're fighting shadows we can't reach, we can't make accountable, and we cannot defeat. And we need to understand that, and that needs to inform us as we approach cybersecurity. 3 Ps at the end. To be effective at cybersecurity, you've got to plan, you've got to practice, and you've got to perfect. You've got to be prepared ahead of when you need to be prepared. And while no one is fully prepared for an incident, you will have more than one incident. So prepare for it now. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at artificial intelligence and cyber. And when I talk about a focus around technology, an over focus on technology, certainly AI is one of those in my view. If I was to ask you the question, what is the most vital thing that all business needs, and without it all will fail, what would you say? Is it customers, capital, cash flow, good suppliers, a good regulatory environment? I mean, all of those are true and all of those are real, but actually the most important thing and the most vital thing that you have without which all businesses will fail is actually trust. You can be the sole supplier of water to a city, and if the citizens of that city do not trust you, they will not take your water. And trust is the fundamental commodity that we have in the organizational sense that we probably don't spend enough time thinking about. The reality is it actually reflects us who we are as humans. We view the world through a value grid in order to filter out extraneous information and to pay attention to what matters. So for a long time, we had this view that what we did as humans was to build a complex model of the world, and then to act in a way and compare the results against the prediction that we had in our minds. And this is the driver for what a lot of the early thinking around cybernetics and AI. Fundamentally, that's been shown not to be correct. The world is far too complex for us to perceive, and we're not particularly good at detecting change. In reality, what we do is we simplify the world to make a tremendous amount of the world irrelevant. There's a very good example of that when Harvard ran an experiment with 6 actors, 3 dressed in white and 3 dressed in black, and the experiment was for them to pass the ball to each other between the white and the black actors, and for the observers to count the number of passes. And the experiment ran for a few minutes, and you had to count the number of passes. And the correct answer, I think, if I can recall correctly, was 16. In the middle of where the actors were passing the ball to each other, another actor dressed as a gorilla walked into the frame, stood in the middle of the frame, beat his chest for about 10 seconds, and then walked off the frame. Around about 50% of the people that are watching this and counting the passes did not see the gorilla. Why? Because the gorilla was filtered, because it was irrelevant, because what we were concentrating on was what was our attention, which was counting the number of passes. So our value structure determines what we perceive, not simply what we expect or what we want. And we structure our lives so that we know what to do all the time. So when our world corresponds to our value system, we have a positive emotional response, and we move forward. And if we have too much complexity, then that leads to heightened anxiety, which leads to all sorts of negative outcomes. So fundamentally, unlike cybernetic theory, we see the world as what matters. It's either tools or obstacles, or it's irrelevant. So it's a place to act rather than a place to perceive objects. So, for example, we don't perceive a chair. What we perceive is a place to sit, and we ignore all the other chairs because there's one chair where we want to sit. So we see the chair not as an object, but effectively as a tool. So fundamentally, it's not about understanding the world in order to predict outcomes. What you're trying to do is to get what you want out of the world. So it requires motivation and emotion. So we want most things to stay irrelevant in order for us to extract meaning. So our appropriate response is actually the minimum that we need to get the outcome that we want. So, and that's a really important component of how we want to respond in cybersecurity. If you like to think about it as what I call the autopilot problem, where we've been very good at developing autopilots in planes that allow us to fly the planes based on an envelope of, I don't know, maybe a dozen parameters. And so what the pilot has done is learned that their frame of reference becomes increasingly lower and lower fidelity, to the point where so long as there's a green light on the autopilot, they are not paying attention. And what we've seen with crashes, where the autopilot suddenly disengages, is the pilot has no context. And suddenly, from seeing the world as mostly irrelevant, so long as the green light was on, they have now got an enormous amount of complexity in the world, and they have no way of handling that complexity. And so the decisions they make and the pressure that they're under compromises their ability to do the right thing. While we have this promise of technology and artificial intelligence, the reality is we've got a long way to go to know how we can make this effective in the particular problem domain with technology and cybersecurity. I guess also it's worth pointing out that we have this issue across science as well. Science is fundamentally about facts, but the reality is that there's an infinite number of facts, and we filter facts based on our grids, our value grids, and those value grids are framed by trust. And so when we have discussions with people, if politics is a classic, it's not so much that people are right or wrong as we'd like to think they are. It's simply that the way that they've filtered the facts and they've sifted and selected the facts is simply different from ours. And so science is fundamentally, although science has been perceived as being about yes and no, right and wrong, or not right and wrong, sorry, truth or not, the fact is it's much more complex than that. there's an infinite complexity in the number of facts, and what we are doing is selecting the facts based on our value grids. So science as it stands is actually not about facts, it's actually about hypothesis, and it's about measurement, and it's about analysis. So it's not a binary thing at all. It's simply dealing with a level of complexity. So if we were to draw that together and think about what does it mean for us in cybersecurity, rather than the promise on the sticker of the box that you might buy that says that we've got some AI with us, the best we can achieve at the moment in the cybersecurity industry is actually what we would call an expert system. It's somebody to complement the human operator in a way that adds value to the human operator. So you are dealing with real-time analysis. You're doing some limited self-learning, but you're trying to enhance and augment the human operator. You are not trying to replace him or her. And we think at the moment, if I was to pull a number out of the air, I think probably 95% of what we are in the technology sector are calling artificial intelligence is actually data analysis. It's simply regression. It's the ability to fit a regression line to a set of data. So it's what we would call traditionally, from a computer science perspective, an expert system rather than anything that would approach AI. So what does that lead us to? Well, it takes us to the same view that we've had for some time, which is the best defense is defense in depth. And we see this in fact in our national COVID response, where we have to my mind anyway, an over-reliance on a single technology that we use for a test. And we know that from a cybersecurity perspective, that no particular technology set is going to be 100% reliable. So the edge case, or the false positive or the false negative, needs to be accounted for. And we do that by applying another technology to complement the core technology. And in the COVID response, that may be as simple as a sniffer dog, completely different technology set, but a very good defence in depth, which we could arguably would be quite a good idea for New Zealand to have at the moment because of our focus on the border. When in cybersecurity, we've got the same thing. It's how do we provide defence in depth? How do we provide a complementary technology that would allow us to catch the things that might slip through the first line of defence? Okay, what does the future look like? Well, firstly, we need to understand that cybersecurity and maturity in cybersecurity and in cybersecurity operations is a very expensive proposition. The costs of establishing a security ops center are high, and bringing it to maturity is a substantial investment, and it's a multi-year investment. You do not get maturity in a security ops center because you buy a technology set. You've got to make fundamental investments in people, in processes, and in innovation and improvement and multi-year improvement to get you to a level of maturity. Staff, we've talked about this, staff shortages and retention are a fact of life. Currently, CISOs average about 2 years before you lose them, and your first line analysts will last about 12 to 18 months before they move on. There's an enormous shortage of people, and so you've got to start thinking about how you deal with continual staff retention and challenges and shortages. We've got too much technology, as we said, and we've got the challenge of retention. So one of the things that we see a number of organisations doing is starting to procure cybersecurity services as an antidote to those two problems. It allows you to procure outcomes, if you like, or establish a baseline for outcomes in a way that allows you to jump the curve and get further up it more quickly than you would have if you were trying to do it yourself. But it also makes sense to start to think about how do you collaborate across the sector and do that in a way that you can cooperate and do it together. And we do this in New Zealand more than we think. If we think about the FPOS network in New Zealand that we've used for 30 years, that is a cooperative venture between the major banks in New Zealand, and it's run as a core infrastructure ecosystem that the banks will compete over. And I think sectors need to start thinking about this as a way of that they might start to provide better cybersecurity operations sophistication cooperatively across the sector. So we also need to focus on improving the governance models that we have in cybersecurity. We must be able to articulate the vision, your mission, your objectives within the context of your overall risk posture, your compliance and regulatory obligations, and obviously your support of your overall business goals. Dollar in prevention is worth a lot more will save you a lot more in terms of what the cure will cost you. And remember that prevention can be delivered by good policy, not necessarily technology. Deterrence is probably underappreciated. You have to be very careful about how you would frame up deterrence and what deterrence means. My example of deterrence is simply the sign on your gate that says, beware of the dog that bites. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a dog that bites. So I think what you are trying to do is effectively with a sign on the gate, you're just trying to send the burglar to your neighbour rather than to yourself. So I think deterrence is something that can be considered and should be part of what a cybersecurity strategy looks like. And I think the last thing in the future is the consequences of failure will continue to escalate. And I can't see any sign that is going to be less true in the next few years. Just quickly to close, what would I consider to be the New Zealand Defence Forces and the defence sector's advantage? I think one of your substantial advantages is what I would call capability and development. We are in the 21st century, and we have been for some time, and we need to recognise that what has worked for us in the past is not necessarily what will work for us today into the future. And a majority of our 21st century technical skills can and should be potentially developed as a trade. Cybersecurity is certainly one of those. We have in New Zealand, and with work with the government cyber strategy, we have a 1-year level 6 diploma, which is in the polytech sector in New Zealand at the moment, that allows us to develop cybersecurity talent, and it adopts an apprenticeship or an intern model where the internship or the apprenticeship is served throughout the year of study. And those people are working in our Datacom at the moment from Unitec, and we've got a lot of interest around the country for that particular pathway. Now the defence industry has a very good and diverse talent pool, and you have a history of skills training and reskilling people. And so if I pull all that together, I think fundamentally cybersecurity talent needs to be seen through a trade lens. And that trade lens is something that can be used for organisations within the defence sector to create a pathway for your own talent, and to use that pathway for whatever stage people are at, whether they are students or whether they are mid-career, to actually create the talent that you need to help you with cybersecurity. And ultimately, I think what I'd like to see happen in the defence sector is this focus on what does a sector response look like for cybersecurity operations, utilising talent pathways, utilising suppliers that have experience in this like Datacom. What does that look like, and how can we make that work and improve the cybersecurity posture across the whole of the sector? And that brings me to questions. Thank you.